Good morning and welcome back to the Headwaters. We're here. I'm James Hill. This is
Mindy Bonine.
We're out here to give you guys our 7th weekly update that we've had out at the site. And today we are in Block A, the Burned Rock Block.
Burned Rock Block, yeah.
But real quickly, before we get into that, I wanted to remind everyone to like it and subscribe us and check out our YouTube channel that most of you are watching right now. Please share your link to Facebook or Instagram or wherever, and we'd love to have more viewers on here. And also, I'd like to remind you to please, throughout this segment, post your questions, and we'd be happy to answer at any point.
Okay.
So, just to give you guys kind of a brief update of the site, last week we had 3 inches of rainfall between Thursday and Friday, and so that basically cut our week short after Thursday, so we really didn't get a whole lot more open in the excavation blocks. But we were fortunate to have 2 visitors out at the site last week in Dr. Charles Frederick and Dr. Steve Black of Texas State University. And both of them came out to the site, visited, and kind of gave us some of their interpretations and suggestions throughout as our excavations continue on.
Charles Frederick is our geomorphologist who basically studies the composition of dirt and sediments. And then Steve Black is an expert in burned rock middens, and so he's a professor at Texas State. He was fortunate, he was very kind of him to come out and take a look at what we've got and sort of give us some recommendations as to sort of where we should sort of direct our further research, and we're sort of incorporating that into what we're doing, what we will be doing over the next week.
Yeah. As you can see over here in Block A, Charles, part of his job is to come out and to do a soil sample, soil column, and he's able to ascertain a number of things, including dates, soil composition, stuff like that. And this column right here is one of the ones that Charles excavated out at the site, and he kind of it sort of helps us guide our excavations as we continue going further. And so part of Charles's expertise is kind of dating the soils and helping us decide where we want to open future blocks. And we'll get into that more next week in our next week video. But kind of to summarize, essentially Block D, which we'll feature again in a later segment, is going to be our area that we think we're going to get our deepest and oldest deposits. Definitely early Archaic and potentially into the Paleo-Indian period. So we're looking forward to that. That was a great help. In Block C, last week, we did get a couple features exposed and excavated, both of which were feature 54 and 53 we finished excavating. And 54 was just a kind of a small cluster of burnt rocks that we think might have been like a prepping area that the rocks would eventually have made their way into the
into the adjacent hearth features. So there were 2 features that were hearth features that were right next to the rocks that we found, and we cracked them open and found out that they were slightly burned, but they weren't burned enough. They weren't heated enough to make them crack into smaller pieces, so they could have still been used again, maybe once or 2 other times. So we're thinking that might be sort of like just a pile of source material that they were using to feed the fire as things were going, as the food was cooking. They would add more rocks to it, just like they would be adding firewood to it.
And like I said, it was a brief week, so we didn't really have a huge opportunity to expose more features in there. But we did, like I said, Dr. Black came out and he kind of focused on this area that we're working in right now in Block A. As you can see, we've had a couple updates out here. This is a large burned rock midden that I'm standing in right here, and then in the corner we have a what we call a central heating element, or an oven,
thermal oven
of some sort.
Yeah.
But also that brings us to what Carly here has been excavating, and our featured feature of the week, which is a new, what we think is another oven or heating element that we have.
So this is a good example of when we sort of begin to see a feature come out of the dirt. We hit the tops of it, topmost rocks. We try to dig down a little bit and to see if there are any rocks that are adjacent to it or near it. And then we slowly sort of pick out the dirt that's in between all these rocks, and then try to expose everything that's on the top. And then sort of probe down to see if we can find out, you know, if the rocks are a little bit further down, and how big it might be. And this is kind of like the slow, time-consuming process that we have to do to be able to sort of keep this stuff in, sort of keep its integrity, so we can study it and map it and record it and all that. But you can see it's a really dense cluster, very much like the other feature that's on the opposite corner, and quite a bit different than the scattered burned rocks that you're seeing everywhere else. And there's also a gap, as you can see, kind of between the edge and where the burned rock cluster begins. So we're pretty sure that it is another hearth feature. It could be like an earth oven, or it could be just another stovetops type feature. But we're hoping to be able to expose more of it as we dig down where my feet are standing.
Yeah, and interesting about, I'm sure you guys can see the green flags that Carly's inserted into her feature during her excavation, and they actually are denoting two different sections of bone, and we think we're pretty confident that she got a large section of a bison femur and also a phalanx, which is a sort of a finger bone.
It's a finger or toe bone, yeah.
And we did get another diagnostic lithic tool. Looks like to be a drill, but it's broken in one end, so we're not definitive on it. So all of these things kind of together have sort of, we're pretty confident that we have another sort of heating element or oven feature going on out here. So yeah, that's our update so far out at the site, and now we're going to move on to our second segment, and Mindy's going to take you guys through a walk in time.
Yep. All right, follow me. We're going to walk this way back. One of the things that we get asked about a lot when we're out here at the site is to, one, how old everything is. And we talk and we say numbers like, oh, it's 3,000 years old or 5,000 years old. But we realize that that's just a sequence of numbers, and it really has no sort of understanding about how long ago we're talking about. So we decided to create a little timeline that's on our fence here to help sort of explain how much time we're actually talking about. We sort of get it sort of get wrapped up in 1,000-year increments, but when you're mapping it all out, it really does turn out to be a whole lot bigger than just some random numbers that are in your head. So to walk us through the timeline, we decided we start here at the end of our timeline, which is the present day. So this currently, where you're seeing all of these sort of signs that we have posted, is kind of our modern world. So our understanding of how our world works, things like cars and the internet and streets and buildings and things like that, all kind of happened in this period of time right here. So we kind of, just to give you a sense as to how long this timeline is, we kind of started with the modern world, and now we're gonna move on to the past. This timeline is set up in every 50 years is about a foot. So 1 foot is about 50 years. So your average today's lifespan is about 78 years. So it's about 18 inches. So this is one person's life from beginning to end on average. So we can sort of span down the edge of the fence and can see how many lives we're talking about. And we're going to walk all the way down to the end of the fence, and that is how much time we're talking about. So we're going to begin really briefly with this red tape is the historic period, and the historic period is, well, our modern time. So we're talking about sort of like the United States kind of comes to about here. This period of time is kind of like Spanish colonial period here in Texas, is this section, and then we get back to the really early period with the European exploration in the New World, and that's kind of this section. This is beginning the late prehistoric period. This is this, and this overlap really, because when we're talking about the historic period, there's a big crossover between the historic sort of sort of Anglo settlers of Texas and the Native American occupants that were here already. So there's a bit of an overlap in this section. But since we are talking about prehistoric peoples, we're going to sort of switch from historic modern people to the Native American groups that were here previously. So this blue line is kind of like the late prehistoric period. This is the period of time where Native American groups, both here in central Texas and elsewhere in Texas and other places in the United States, had sort of both bow and arrow technology, ceramic technology, pottery, and agriculture. So agriculture here in central Texas was not very prominent. There was very little evidence of agriculture here, even through this period, this very recent period of time. Unlike the Caddo or the Mississippian cultures or the Pueblo cultures that are to the west, they had very strong agricultural practices. Here in central Texas, they pretty much sort of maintained a mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle all the way through contact period, so all the way through the historic period. But they did have ceramics and bow and arrow technology. So we define the late prehistoric period by those things that are present in the archaeological record. With ceramics and bow and arrow technology, we also had some evidence of there was a population growth, so there are more people here than there were in the past, and we also might have some evidence that those people, since there were more people around, they would fight with each other more often. So, and with agriculture, usually people are more sedentary, so they have reason to stay in one place and maybe try to fight off their neighbors. So, so what happened before that? Oh, actually, hold on. Before I begin, one more thing I want to mention is that since we're talking about such a long time, we also talk a little bit about the changes in the climate. Today and the late prehistoric period are kind of roughly the same climate-wise, but once we get to the next section, then the climate sort of changes quite dramatically, and the people who lived here changed their practices as a result. So let's keep walking back through here, and I'm going to stop here at the transition between the late prehistoric and the archaic people, and Josh is going to walk all the way down to the end of the archaic period. And now you can see right from the get-go that the archaic period is by far the biggest period of time that we're talking about on our timeline. So we'll keep walking, keep walking. Keep going. Keep going. Okay.
I made it.
Hey, all right. Okay. So, as you might be able to notice, we have a lot more stuff here on the board on this side, a whole lot less on this side. And it's because we have more knowledge about what's happening in the recent past and less knowledge about what's happening in our ancient past. But we have put some things on the board, sort of events that are happening worldwide, and we're going to walk down through here. And then I'm going to talk about the archaic period here in central Texas while we're walking. So, I'm going to walk through here. This is, the archaeologists love to categorize things. So we took this super, super long period of time and we divided it into 3 bits. The early archaic, middle archaic, and late archaic. And the late archaic is this bit right here, is kind of where I'm standing. The late archaic was kind of the end of a very drought period that was happening in the earlier part. So it was a little bit more wet than sort of what was happening in the past. This is the period of time where we're seeing all these hot rock cooking elements. So the late archaic were hot rock cooking, both earth ovens and sort of oven or sort of stovetop features were very much in use at this period. We also had the transition up there. We had arrow points. Back here, we're having dart points. So they were hunting with really long spears at this point. And the animals that they were hunting were mostly like deer and bison, and sort of large foraging land animals were kind of being hunted during this period. But as we walk through earlier in time, the Middle Archaic, which I'm going to have to do some walking, so you get a sense as to what was happening worldwide sort of during the Archaic period. So we're going to keep walking, until I get about to the middle of our pink line, which is kind of right here. So this is the period of time in Egypt when the pyramids of Giza were being constructed. So you can imagine in your mind's eye what was happening elsewhere in the world while we are stuck right in the middle of the Archaic period. Now, this is the period of time, the Middle Archaic, is where all of these hot rock cooking features were really being used. The climate, at this point, we were going through a really big drought. So it was very hot and very dry. Food resources were more scarce than they were either before or after. And so they utilized, they really made use of the hot rock cooking to be able to sort of process all their foodstuffs. Sorry guys, I have some notes. It was in, sort of full swing. The types of plants that they would cook on these hot rock cooking elements would be soltol, prairie turnips, cattail roots, acorns, and wild onions. And they hunted, at this point, primarily deer. Bison were not as prevalent in this part of the world as they kind of moved on to sort of more areas of the continent that were more adaptable to what they like to see. So there wasn't really as much bison present here, so they would be hunting other animals instead. So let's move back. That's Middle Archaic. So what happened before that? Let's keep going. We're going to move on to the Early Archaic. So we're going to keep going. As you can see, all the stuff that we're seeing on these signs, we know from archaeological evidence. So we don't have any records, either written record or pictures or anything of this particular time period. So all the information that we're sort of displaying right here, like for example when the potter's wheel was developed in the old world, we know this information from archaeological deposits. So all right, so we're getting close to Josh here. So this, you can see how much time we're talking about. People in the Archaic pretty much lived the same way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. That, environment may have changed a little bit. They may have used one technology a little bit more than another technology, but for the most part, they lived largely the same way as throughout this entire orange time period. It worked for them. They were suitably adapted for this terrain, this environment. They were able to change their methodology of living as circumstances changed, the environment changed a little. So this orange time period we mark mostly because of its similarities more than its differences. And that's, even though we divide it into early, middle, late, it's kind of arbitrary. The early, middle, late. There wasn't really big changes between these periods of time, as opposed to both later and earlier, so which we'll get to in just a minute. So here we are in early Archaic. This is the beginning of the Archaic period. This is where they developed hot rock cooking technology. Then this climate was not as dry as the middle, but it was still kind of getting the land was still drying out, and the people were living in the areas like here where they would have reliable sources of water. The bison were present here during this period of time, and like I'm saying, when I'm talking about what animals were available, again, it kind of changed a little bit over time. Sometimes they were more prevalent, sometimes they were less, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were either present or absent altogether. It just meant there's a little bit more or a little bit less. We also see at this early period, they start to develop the mano and metate, which is kind of for processing plant foods. and it's sort of more in-depth processing of plant foods instead of just throwing it on a fire. They were sort of using sort of physical technology to be able to sort of change the plant fibers to be able to make them more digestible and edible. Early Archaic is when that sort of thing happened. So, all right, Josh, here we are.
Hi.
Into the late Paleo, beginning of the Archaic. So, Josh, you want to walk down?
Bye.
So, bye. He's walking. So, I'm going to go ahead and keep talking. This period of time, between the Paleo-Indian and the Archaic period, we changed colors because there was a big change in the archaeological record. So here we see hot rock cooking and sort of hunting bison and deer and sort of a range animals. This is the mark where they changed to a different type of hunting scenario, a different type of living scenario altogether. We can see that in the archaeological record. And this is also a pretty long period of time, but it's not quite as long as the Archaic. The Archaic is by far the longest. So here we go. We're going to walk towards Josh at this point. As you can see, really, we don't have much on the board. It's a lot of empty. And because this is the oldest period of time when humans were inhabiting this continent. And there weren't very many of them, and they didn't leave a whole lot of evidence. And the evidence that they did leave is either underwater now, or buried very, very deep. And so that's why we're super excited about seeing if we can find a Paleo-Indian component to this site, is because we get a chance to go that deep to see if we might be able to find intact Paleo-Indian components. So, Paleo-Indian, we have one sign here. That's kind of pig domestication. But that's pretty much it for the Paleo-Indian period. This is the period of time after the last ice age. So it was very cold and very wet. We sort of about, in the early 20th century, we would call these people the Mammoth Hunters. They were sort of romanticized in a lot of books and films and things like that. But mammoths were present during this time period, but they and all the other megafauna, word of the day, megafauna, were starting to become extinct because the weather was changing and they weren't suitably adapted to this kind of climate. So there were bison during this period of time. There was also ancient horse during this period of time, but both mammoths and horses and ancient camels had died out at this point, sort of during this period of time as they started to die out, but bison sort of remained as the only sort of megafauna still present. Even up to today, there's still bison running around. But they didn't just do big game hunting. They hunted smaller game, and they also ate a lot of sort of smaller animals, including turtles, alligator, mice, raccoons. They were highly mobile. So when you're thinking about sort of the Archaic peoples being mobile hunter-gatherers during that period of time, compared to us, they were quite mobile. Compared to the Archaic peoples, these guys were really mobile. I mean, they just didn't stay anywhere for any period of time. They were constantly on the move. And the interesting thing about the Paleo-Indian groups is that their technology seems to be very similar across the entire continent. So you can sort of sense as to how mobile they were. We're talking about them moving thousands and thousands of miles over a very short period of time, and then sort of leaving all very similar sorts of artifacts from one end of the continent to the other. So there's Paleo-Indian groups throughout, even all the way into South America. So these were the most mobile, and they hunted the most sort of big game, and that's kind of how they were, sort of how we understand them to be in the archaeological record. So we're getting back to Josh right here. we're at the end of the Paleo-Indian period. Let me go ahead and look at my notes. Okay. So we're kind of, this is about 14,000 years from the end of that fence to about here. We're thinking that might go 15,000 years ago, so you can see how long it is. Just to give you a sense as to if we extended our timeline, modern humans would appear in the world in sort of that way, in green. Dinosaurs lived 700 miles away, sort of right around Cincinnati, Ohio. And then if we extended this timeline yet again, the Earth itself would begin about 4.5 billion years ago. That's 3/4 of the way around the Earth. So this gives a sense as to what kind of, we're talking about a very long time for humans, but in comparison to those kinds of timelines, it's actually very short. So, and that's our timeline. You guys are welcome to come and sort of explore our timeline in a little bit more detail. Please come out, and we'll be happy to give you a little tour. But we have several sort of tour groups coming up. Please sign up and come out and take a look at our timeline. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys have about our timeline.
Yeah, and we'll be out again next week, guys. So feel free, like I said, subscribe to the Headwaters. We're going to be focusing more on some of our deeper excavations as we progress, that Mindy alluded to in the Archaic period and the Paleo-Indian period, hopefully. So again, subscribe, come join us at the Headwaters, and we'd love to see you soon.
Also, one other thing, before we forget, there is a link on this YouTube channel and in the Headwaters of the Comal website to a Excel spreadsheet that has our timeline on it, so you can explore that in a lot more detail. There's more things on that spreadsheet than we have currently right here, but if you want to do some comparisons between what was happening around the world and what was happening here in Central Texas, that's a really good resource.
Awesome. Yeah, so thanks guys, we'll see you again next week.
Okay, thanks.